Hello, I'm Fuli Batibo. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, giving Africa a voice, the group of the world's 20 leading economies adds the African Union as a permanent member, but will the G20 champion the developing world? Also this week, Morocco is a top tourist destination and a bright spot for investors. The economy could bear the brunt of the nation's biggest earthquake in a century. Plus, Egypt's annual inflation hits a new record, and Egyptians are feeling the pinch of the rising cost of living. So, can the government bring prices down? Thank you for joining us. African nations are drowning in debt. They're among the worst hit by the impact of extreme weather and food insecurity. Yet Africans have long complained about not having a say on issues that affect them the most in global institutions dominated by wealthy nations. India aims to become a leader of the developing world. It's been pushing the needs of the global south on the world stage since it assumed the rotating presidency of the G20. In what was seen as a powerful recognition of Africa's status, the group of 20 top world economies added the African Union as a permanent member. The AU, which includes 55 nations with a collective GDP of $3 trillion, will now have the same status as the EU in the G20. Leaders also agreed to pursue tripling renewable energy capacity globally by 2030 at their annual summit in New Delhi. Other issues high on the agenda included climate financing, debt, and reforming institutions like the World Bank. So, what is the G20 and why does it need the African Union at the table? The group consists of 19 nations and the European Union. They collectively represent more than 80% of the world's economic output. The G20 aims to unite global decision makers on issues like the economy, politics, healthcare, and climate change. But it's been criticized for leaving out the needs of the developing world. Until recently, South Africa was the only African member of the group.
Now we are moving towards a direction that includes those parts of the world that were excluded. We share a lot of common challenges, particularly with respect to climate change. And those issues cannot be resolved through exclusive approaches. They have to be inclusive. They have to include those affected and those that bear the most responsibility in guiding the world through these challenges.
By granting the AU full membership, the G20 aims to give a bigger voice to the global south. Africa is home to about 17% of the world's population. The UN expects the continent's young people of 1.3 billion to double by 2050. Africa is rich in renewable energy resources and minerals, and it attracts investments from different countries, including the US and China. The continent also has the world's largest free trade area. Well, to unpack all this, I'm now joined from Dakar, Senegal's capital, by Daouda Sembène. He's the CEO of the Global Development Advisory AfriCatalyst. Thank you so much, Mr. Sembène, for joining us. So, the G20 admitting the African Union into the group, is this real change or just a symbolic move in your view?
I think it goes beyond symbolism in my mind. I think it's a very good move. It helps actually the G20 gain more legitimacy. It also helps actually the group becoming more representative and inclusive by adding the African Union. It has 55 more countries to the 43 countries that are actually currently member of the G20, including the European Union. So that's certainly a good move. And finally, I believe also it actually helps the G20 becoming more effective, because I think now you have around the table a key representative of countries that are sort of affected by major challenges that the G20 tries to address. So I think this is very good for both parties, both the G20 and the African Union.
What immediate changes do you expect? The African Development Bank, the AFDB, had repeatedly, of course, called for faster action for international finance architecture reform. Is there not cause to be more optimistic as a result of the AU joining the G20 bloc? What is at stake, you think?
Well, I think immediately what we can see and that we can welcome is actually there is Africa's voice being heard in the G20 deliberation. That's a very good development. Now, I think I would not actually sort of consider this membership of the African Union at the G20 as a panacea. I think it's going to depend on how the African Union is going to use that seats to the best extent possible to push its agenda and make sure that the decisions that are taken by the G20 are in line with its own priorities. So yes, this is a good move. It's beyond symbolism, but certainly it's not necessarily going to be a panacea.
Mr. Sembène, as you say, Africans will now have a voice, but will they be speaking with one voice?
That's a good question, because I think what we have seen on economic issues that is that Africa has not necessarily been speaking with the same voice. I think we have seen a lot of head of state, or actually a number of them, speaking about those issues very occasionally. But as a whole, the African Union has not been necessarily actually been heard on those issues. So I think it's going to be important for the body to be able to shape and formulate common position on global economic issues that its representatives will be able to convey to the G20 when they sit around the table.
All right, Mr. Sembène, stay with us. The African Union's admission into the G20 comes as India and China are competing for influence in the developing world. Bilateral trade between Beijing and Africa stood at nearly $280 billion in 2022, while trade between New Delhi and Africa came in at just under $100 billion. The move also comes after the BRICS bloc, which also includes China and India, said it welcomes 6 new nations, among them the African states, Ethiopia and Egypt. So, Mr. Sembène, is this announcement, you think, a win for India? Can India become a leader for the Global South?
No, certainly it's a very big win for India. I think it is under the presidency of the G20 of India that the African Union has been able to join the G20. This is something to celebrate. And certainly India being also a member of the BRICS, this is certainly something that is going to be very much playing out favorably for the country. So yes, I believe this is something that is very much welcome. But I have to say that this is something that was actually in the making for a long time.
Yeah, it was expected.
Yes.
Yeah, but what about India and China? Will they be competing now for influence in the developing world, do you think?
Well, I don't know if you're talking about the G20 itself. Of course, they're both members. They would be able to certainly join forces with developing
But I mean, on the
countries
African continent specifically, you've got a huge Chinese presence, of course, in a number of countries, but India now slowly going in as well. Are we going to see a competition between these two powers on the African continent?
Well, I believe that type of competition has been on the way for a long time, right? Not only between India and China, but between major powers, both emerging market and advanced economies in Africa. But I think this is something that is expected to continue regardless of the AU memberships of the G20.
And then there's also the BRICS, which aims to champion the Global South and represent a counterweight to institutions like the G20. Do you think Africa benefits from these competing alliances?
Well, I think that if anything, Africa should be able to leverage its relationship with all major powers, whether they're from the BRICS or from other grouping, the G7, the G20, to be able to maximize its opportunities and interests. I think that's certainly in the best interest of Africa, and I believe it is it's up to the authorities in African countries to be able to make that happen, and certainly being able to leverage all the partnership that are available to the continent, whether they're coming from the BRIC, from the G7, from the G20. I think it is what African countries need to do.
Dauda Sembène, thank you very much for talking to us. Dauda Sembène is CEO of the Global Development Advisory, AfriCatalyst, joining us there from Dakar. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Now, separately, an ambitious project aimed at boosting trade between Europe, the Middle East and Asia has been announced on the sidelines of the G20 summit. The so-called economic corridor links Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Israel, India and the EU through shipping ports and rail routes. US President Joe Biden hailed the agreement as a game-changing investment. It is Morocco's strongest earthquake in 120 years. The UN says at least 300,000 people have been affected. As well as a tragic loss of human life, the earthquake has reduced entire villages to rubble. The potential cost of the damage could reach up to $10 billion. Aid has been trickling into some of the remote regions where many people lost their loved ones and their livelihoods. Hashim Ahilbara reports from Wergan, south of Marrakesh.
This was once a vibrant local community full of life, joy and big dreams about tomorrow. Now it's all gone. Many people didn't make it. They were buried under the rubble, only to be retrieved days later, dead. This is definitely going to put more strains on the efforts by the Moroccan government when it comes to how to move forward. It said that it is committed to rebuilding the entire area and compensating those who lost loved ones and their own businesses. This was a popular tourist attraction, particularly for Western tourists, to enjoy the beautiful landscape, the snow-capped mountains, and also trekking the hills surrounding the area. And for that particular reason, many of the people who lived here used to convert their own houses into guest houses. Now they've lost everything. Now, we have to wait and see how the government is going to implement its rehabilitation and reconstruction program, because we're talking about an economy which has suffered in the past from the impact of COVID-19 and from global inflation. And at this particular stage, we are yet to get a sense of the total cost of damage and reconstruction effort, which is going to be implemented in the upcoming weeks. Hashim Ahilbara for Counting the Cost, Al Jazeera.
While the Moroccan economy has been struggling with the impact of the global pandemic, the fallout of the war in Ukraine and drought, but it was forecast to recover this year with a GDP growth of more than 3%. Morocco will be hosting World Bank and IMF meetings in October. The earthquake could derail that recovery. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that damage could cost up to 8% of the country's GDP. The quake has damaged Marrakesh, a top tourist destination. Tourism is one of the main drivers of the economy and is among the sectors expected to be affected. Thousands of traditional houses in remote rural villages were destroyed. The majority of them are likely not covered by insurance. The government has pledged to provide funding to households to rebuild their homes. Joining us now from Rabat in Morocco is Lassane Haddad. He's a senator and an economic expert and former minister. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Haddad, on Counting the Cost. The disaster certainly seemed to have put the spotlight on Morocco's income inequality and infrastructure development. Rural areas were already vulnerable and are among the hardest hit by this earthquake. Many homes, as we've said, were not insured. The disaster, it seems, has only amplified some of the injustices and inequalities that already existed. Can you tell us first about the areas that are affected by this earthquake and the issues they were already facing before the disaster?
Well, I think that there is a big disparity between the rural areas and the urban areas when it comes to development and human development and access to social services. That's in Morocco in general. But there is another kind of disparity between the mountainous areas and other areas which are also rural. So if you go to the plains and then you go to the mountains, you'll find that kind of disparity. And then the high atlas is compounded by the fact that it's very high. People live in very small hamlets on top of elevations in order historically to protect themselves. They've created this culture of wanting to be like isolated. So it was a kind of different, like a difficult kind of process of trying to bring those kinds of communities up to speed. So the government has built a lot of schools. There are a lot of dispensaries. There is a huge promise and also ambitious program of building roads and all of that. So they have been in a better shape than they were like 20 years ago. but still they have not yet kept up with the rest of the rural areas, let alone with the urban areas. It's a very traditional kind of localized kind of culture in the high Atlas Mountains, suffering a little bit from isolation, despite the different kinds of programs that have been consented by the different governments of Morocco.
So a traditional way of life in these very close-knit communities, it would seem. Now, the Moroccan government has been criticized somewhat for accepting limited aid during this earthquake. They say too much aid could cause bottlenecks, of course. Is it for logistical reasons, as the Moroccan government says, Professor Lassen Haddad, or are politics also at play here? Some have accused the government of putting politics perhaps before the well-being of Moroccan people by accepting aid from only a certain number of countries.
Well, to say that Morocco has blocked aid for political reasons is wrong, and I think it's also like verges on immoral kind of attitude. I don't think that happens, and people who know the high Atlas Mountains know that it's very, very difficult to get to those kinds of communities. So it took the Moroccan government like about 3 or 4 days to clear the roads from the rubble that fell as a result of the earthquake, and then aftershocks like created more problems, which was very difficult. Some of the machinery were lifted on huge kind of trucks to take it there. They used the helicopters to get to the communities. There is no use of getting humanitarian aid waiting at the foothills of different mountains like for 4 or 5 days, and we don't know what the needs of those communities. So the Moroccan government has enough resources to deal with this situation.
But do you think it might derail the economic recovery that Morocco had been experiencing before this disaster?
Well, I think also it's an opportunity for Morocco to bring those kinds of communities up to speed. And I think if we invest in the high Atlas Mountains and then create like huge economic dynamics. By the way, the city of Marrakesh has not been hit. And so the city of Marrakesh continues to do business as usual, and then it will be always a locomotive for tourism in that kind of region. And if the high Atlas Mountain, then we rebuild it, we reconstruct and all of that, it's an opportunity for Moroccan economy in that kind of region to contribute to the national effort. I think the Moroccan economy has reached a level where it has enough resilience. I mean, this is huge, this is big. It's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take a little bit of a toll on the growth, but I don't think it's going to be a bigger one. And on the longer run, it's going to be like an opportunity for better growth for those kinds of regions.
Professor Lassen Haddad, thank you so much for joining us on Counting the Cost. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Devastating floods have killed thousands of people, with many still missing in the coastal Libyan city of Derna. Heavy rainfall last week caused 2 dams to burst. Areas which were already struggling with limited infrastructure have now been completely destroyed. We spoke to Dr. Hani Shanib, who is originally from Derna. He's also the president of the National Council on U.S.-Libya Relations. He says the scale of the devastation is unprecedented.
This is a city that is cut off completely from the world. It is beleaguered by the fact that there is no proper governance in Libya, in a failed state that has struggled over the last 12 years and unable to basically provide the basic structure in a stable condition, let alone a disaster that has happened very quickly in Derna. The tragedy that is happening in there is not only absent from the international community, but it's also there's some challenges in reaching out to inform the world of what is happening in the city today.
Now, from food to medical services and housing, prices in Egypt have rocketed in the past year. Many Egyptians, particularly among the working class, are struggling to keep up with the rising cost of living. Nearly a third are poor, and millions fear they could be pushed into poverty. Let's take a look at the figures. As we can see here, consumer prices in urban areas rose to almost 40% in August, according to the state-run CAPMA statistic agency. That's more than double what it was a year ago. The agency says the main drivers of inflation were food and beverage, up by almost 72%, restaurant and hotel services up by nearly 50%, while transportation rose by 15%. Now, Egypt is facing one of its worst economic crises in decades, worsened by the fallout of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Both nations are main suppliers to Egypt, which is the world's largest wheat importer. The war has pushed the prices of basic commodities up globally. The Egyptian government is short of foreign currency and struggling to pay for imports. Businesses and households are forced to pay more to buy dollars at the black market. Joining us now from Cairo is Miret F. Mabrouk. She's the Director of Egypt and Horn of Africa Program at the Middle East Institute. Miret, thank you so much for joining us on Counting the Cost. What's driving this increase in prices? We've heard about some of the external factors. What are the internal factors?
The causes of inflation are basically the same the world over, but in some cases they're aggravated by particular factors. In Egypt, it's really a matter of three things that are all related to the devaluation that you were just talking about. One, there is a decrease in the supply of goods, and that's because of the devaluation. There aren't enough dollars on the market to buy some things. Two, there is an increase in production costs, and that's for exactly the same problem. And then there has been a rise for demands on goods and services. And all of that is complicated by the fact that Egypt is a country that essentially imports significantly more than it exports. And therefore, when there haven't been enough dollars on the market to buy the things that you've needed to try and produce what you need, or buy what you need, or sell what you need, then you have a significant crunch.
Yeah. Some have also blamed, Miret, Egypt's economic model, with the military playing a key role controlling large sectors of the economy, borrowing for prestige projects with limited economic benefits. To what extent has economic mismanagement also contributed to the current predicament Egypt finds itself in?
So I don't think it's any secret that a large part of it, I mean, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you had an economic global downturn. This hasn't just hit Egypt. It's just that Egypt's economic policies and priorities made it particularly vulnerable to this kind of problem. And I don't really think that it's any secret that a large chunk of that problem was the state, which includes the military, the state's over-involvement in the economy. And as a matter of fact, during the last meeting with the IMF, for the last loan that Egypt negotiated with the IMF, a major condition that the fund had was that the state step back from the state, which includes the military, step back from its role in the economy.
Yeah, well, Miret, stay with us. Let's take a look at some of those IMF conditions a bit closer now. The IMF is demanding a shift to a flexible exchange rate, among other reforms, as part of a $3 billion bailout package for Egypt. Investors, mainly in the Gulf, want to see a cheaper pound before buying up Egyptian state assets. But the Egyptian government has warned currency devaluations could push prices higher and hurt people's incomes. The Egyptian pound has lost half of its value since March of 2022. So, Miret, will the government eventually shift towards a flexible exchange rate? And would that affect inflation and its foreign currency reserves?
Yes and yes. That's the short answer. The longer answer is the government sort of immediately devalued about 3 times and then stopped because, quite frankly, there weren't enough dollars on the market for it to be able to continue to devalue safely. And the IMF realizes that, which is why the review that was supposed to be done, the first review that was supposed to be done on the IMF loan was months ago, and it's been delayed and delayed and delayed. I mean, the IMF is aware of the circumstances. Now, eventually, Egypt is going to have to devalue again. My guess is it will be later this year, sometime in winter, well before the end of the year.
Right.
But it held it off just because there weren't enough dollars on the market. But yes, it's going to have to devalue.
Right.
And there are benefits to this. There are a lot of benefits to this, particularly on the export side.
Right. Now, even before this crisis, Miret, 30% of Egyptians were living below the poverty line, according to the World Bank. And I wonder, how has the high inflation rate affected the average Egyptian citizen's daily life?
It's hit everybody, but obviously, if you're in the top 2% of the socioeconomic strata, then you are more cushioned. But for everyone else, it's meant that a lot of things have to come off the table. There are people who can no longer afford meat. There are people who can no longer afford chicken. People are making constant choices over what they can and can put on the market, on their table, over what they can and can't buy for their children. And it's especially bad for, if you're sick and you need medicines, that because of the dollar shortage, there are a lot of imported medicines that are no longer available. So Egyptians have felt this crunch in every slice of their life. It's been extremely difficult.
Yeah, Miret, thank you so much for shedding light on the situation in Egypt there for us. Miret Mabrouk, Director of Egypt and Horn of Africa Program at the Middle East Institute in Cairo. Thank you very much for being on Counting the Cost.
You're welcome.
And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us on X. I'm at Foliba AJE, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online, of course, at aljazeera.com/CTC. That will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Foliba Thibault from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news is next on Al Jazeera.